And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. The U.S. government is attacking the African People's Socialist Party, also known as the Uhuru movement, with a racist trope, accusing them of working for a foreign power. And Western imperialism is facing stiff opposition in the heart of Africa. Joining us now to discuss this and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston, Texas, author, historian, researcher, and friend of the show. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Black Agenda Report, which I might recommend for everyone here, blackagendareport.com. We have Margaret Kimberly on here and there, and it's really good. Has an article, Chairman Omali Ashitawa, Uhuru 3, put state on trial in fight back against bogus charges. 3 members of the Uhuru movement were recently indicted on charges related to operating as, quote, unregistered foreign agents. This attack has huge implications for free speech everywhere. You know, we've seen this before, whether it was Martin Luther King or Paul Robeson, black people fighting for their rights ended up being accused of being agents for, generally, it's Russia. Your thoughts?
Well, certainly you have a valid point, and we need to realize that what has ensnared Chairman Omali is a direct product of a structural impediment and flaw at the heart of the settler colonial project and the white supremacist project here in the United States of America. That is to say that anti-blackness is a constituent element of settler colonialism that, of course, helped to underpin and undergird enslavement of Africans for centuries before the U.S. Civil War. And as a result, Black Americans have found it necessary to seek allies overseas. As your comment suggested, this has not only brought Chairman Omali to the table in this regard, but also it reflects upon the late, great Paul Robeson, who also was persecuted because of his fondness for Moscow, the fact that, of course, he was fluent in the Russian language, amongst others. And then there's a further contradiction as well that goes to the heart of the question. That is to say, for decades now, Russophobia has been an essential element in the arsenal of U.S. imperialism. It has a long pedigree stemming from the fact that as Russia was expanding eastward, establishing its window on the Pacific, speaking of Vladivostok in 1860, its rivals in Western Europe, such as Britain, France, etc., were expanding southward to exploit and plunder Africa, and westward towards the Americas, where they got fat, and of course, then, as today, want to challenge Russia. Russia saw that it was in its own best interest, a case of enlightened self-interest, to try to weaken these Western European rivals at the source of their wealth and resources and plunder. That is to say, supporting African liberation, which was the case with regard to the liberation of Southern Africa. This month, we're marking the 30th anniversary of the first democratic elections in South Africa, and we all know about the military assistance rendered by the Soviet Union, not only to Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, but to liberation forces throughout the sub-region, including Namibia, Angola, etc. But even before the formation of the Soviet Union in the 1890s, when you had a significant Pan-African victory, speaking of the victory of Abyssinia, or that is to say Ethiopia, over invading Italian forces, this was based in no small measure upon the fact that the East Africans were armed to the teeth by Russia because it was in their self-interest to do so. And today, we see this reflected once more in the Sahel, where France is beating a hasty retreat and is angry and pointing the finger of accusation at Russia rather than pointing the finger of accusation at itself for pursuing decades of misguided neo-colonial policy that gave countries like Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger no alternative but to boot out the French and call in Russia. So this is part of the dilemma faced, I'm afraid to say, by Chairman Omali, and we must recognize that if they come for him in the morning, as they have done, they'll be coming for the rest of us in the evening.
You know, speaking of Africa, the Sahel, the pushback against Western imperialism, there was a major election in Senegal recently. Macky Sall, who I believe was the head, I think, of the African Union, lost to a opposition figure who, might I add, was in jail for a Facebook post before the election. Your thoughts on the new leader? Again, you know, look at Burkina Faso with Ibrahim Traore, these very young African leaders coming to power, kind of reminding us of some names, you know, Thomas Sankara, et cetera, of the past. Your thoughts on the new leadership in Senegal and, of course, what's happening in Africa?
Well, you are correct. As recently as a few weeks ago, newly installed President Faye and his Prime Minister Sonko were behind bars. Interestingly enough, the former South African President Thabo Mbeki is taking credit for leaning on Macky Sall to release these two men who then surged to victory at the ballot box. The corporate media is making a big to-do about the fact that historically, Senegal has been largely free of military coups, but I don't think that we should rise to that bait because Senegal was largely free of military coups because you had neo-colonial puppet leaders like founding father Leopold Senghor, interestingly enough, a founder as well of the creed then known as Negritude, were basically in the pocket of France. And therefore, there was no need to overthrow the president because President Senghor and many of his subsequent presidents were doing the bidding of Paris. Now, we have to be very careful going forward because that particular rationale has been eroded. Therefore, we must keep a close and careful eye on the Senegalese military. We should pay attention if Senegalese military leaders are all of a sudden given invitations to visit the Pentagon. We must pay attention if the head of AFRICOM, Michael Langley, is in the neighborhood and the vicinity. We should also, as your comment about Thomas Sankara tended to suggest, pay attention to the relationship between leaders, because Thomas Sankara, the charismatic former leader of Burkina Faso, was overthrown ultimately, at least indirectly, by one of his former close comrades who turned out to be in the pay of France. And so recall that before this recent Senegalese election, it was Ousmane Sonko who was slated to run for president, and his deputy was current President Faye. But now the roles have been reversed. It's now President Faye, Prime Minister Sonko. That sets up possibly a contradiction that France and the United States can play upon. And I'm afraid to say we also must watch another intriguing issue. You may have noticed that on the stage the other day, when President Faye was sworn into office, he had both of his wives behind him. And of course, one is more traditional, the other is not. We know that when you had a polygamous president in South Africa, speaking of Jacob Zuma, the U.S. authorities and their British allies were able to play upon the tensions that inevitably flow from such relationships. So we must keep an eye on that. And then we must keep an eye on Côte d'Ivoire, the remaining French puppet in that neighborhood. We know that President Ouattara supposedly has a tunnel leading from his office directly into the French embassy in case he needs to beat a hasty retreat. We must keep a close and careful eye on President Ouattara to make sure he does not interfere in the internal affairs of Senegal. And of course, we know that President Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, was a hawk last year on the question of Niger, when you had the removal of a president and the coming to power of military leaders who then broke relations with France and tried to improve relations with Algeria and Russia. We know that he was counseling for an external intervention. We know that he is not greeted with a warm embrace in Burkina Faso or Mali or Niger, not to mention Algeria. And finally, we must watch to see if President Faye carries through on a campaign promise to weaken relations with France. Already, according to the Financial Times of London, he's moved away from the idea of backing out of this currency arrangement with France, which basically amounts to a West African subsidy to Paris. So once again, this is an important election, but we should not count our chickens before the eggs are hatched.
Naked capitalism, the new junta in Niger tells the United States to pack up its war and go home. But, you know, the U.S. imperialism just doesn't take advice like that. Your thoughts? We got about 2 minutes.
Well, once again, the question comes back to France. France went along with the NATO caper in Ukraine, despite the fact that before February 2022, President Macron was speaking in a dovish fashion. But now we see that that caper has backfired. We see that Russia's economic growth is 3.7, larger than that of most of the European Union, and certainly larger than that of the locomotive of the European Union, speaking of Germany. And so what do we see? We see, according to President Putin, that the recent hawkish remarks of President Macron about putting boots on the ground in Ukraine to confront Russia may be due to pique and irritation at the fact that the former neo-colonial appendages in the Sahel region are backing away and embracing Russia, and therefore Mr. Macron wants payback against Moscow because of what's happening in the Sahel and in Africa. And we also see that Russia is reorienting its economy towards China and India and Africa, and there hangs a tail because with the growth of the Chinese economy, we see irritation and personal petulance with regard to that. Tariffs are in store to try to block Chinese economic development. China will have little choice but to seek to deepen relations with, you guessed it, countries like the Sahel nations. And keep in mind as well that with regard to the Sahel nation's neighbor, speaking of Nigeria, it's on track to have a population of 400 million by the year 2050 in the lifetime of many in your audience, which will make it the third largest nation of planet Earth behind China and India, and therefore a thriving market. And therefore, it seems inevitable that China and Russia will be orienting towards Africa, towards West Africa in particular, and that this will cause tension. It will cause strain with the European Union, with the North Atlantic countries, and therefore our obligation, our role is to make sure that this strain is eased so that war does not result.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher.